Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Tuesday, March 29th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The spring game is in 18 days, the Notre Dame game in 158 days, the game against Michigan in 248 days. The Ohio State football team will be back on the field this morning for practice number 6 of spring ball. Ryan Day, Jim Knowles, and Kevin Wilson will answer questions afterwards. We spent a ton of time over the last week on these shows on the defensive line. Today, we're going to take a couple steps backwards away from the line of scrimmage, and we're going to talk about the linebackers. My guest today is our X's and O's guru, Ross Fulton. Ross, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Tom.
So we've discussed this on the show before, but can you just sort of briefly explain what Jim Knowles is looking for with his linebackers? Like, what role do they play in his defense the way he'd like to play it?
Yeah, I mean, at Oklahoma State and at Duke before that, he liked to what's sometimes referred to as spill and kill the football. And so basically what that means is he wants to force the ball carrier to go east and west towards the sidelines, and then he wants the linebackers to clean that up east to west. So that will come into play quite literally. Oftentimes he'll line up his linebackers in the C gap and bump his defensive line down. So they're, outside of the tackles to begin with. But you also see that, a lot of times, even when they're not, the defensive line will pinch down. We've talked about the different defensive line techniques previously, or take on a gap and a half, so that again the linebackers are free to play the football laterally. He even talked about in his press conference after the first practice how, the structure of the defense is predicated a lot on the linebackers playing in space, both against the run as well as against the pass.
So you had a post on our board over the weekend about the 4 linebackers who you think might best fit that role, what he's really looking for. So who are those guys, and what maybe puts them a little bit ahead of some of the other guys in that linebacker room who are competing for those snaps?
Yeah, and when I say best, sort of what you'd stereotypically think that he would be looking for, who could fill that role. And so the guys that I mentioned were Steel Chambers, Cody Simon, Trip Trainum, and C.J. Hicks. And I think the unifying factor between them is that they can all run. To put it bluntly, obviously 2 of them played tailback at a major college football level. So you get those guys can move, but they're guys that can move, play in space. Maybe what you would more traditionally think of as will linebacker types. And so that's kind of where like my baseline is of how the defense is structured.
So Knowles has said that it is possible to tweak that system. If you don't have the guys who fit that ideal role, you can change the system, change what you're trying to do to fit maybe more, a plugger type linebacker. So I guess this is going to be a multi-part question. Explain a plugger linebacker. What kind of tweak does that require to the defense? How does that change the defense if you don't have the personnel to do what he wants to do? And then what kind of, which linebackers on the team might be more that type of linebacker?
So, I guess, I mean, Tough Borland's like one that immediately jumps to mind, but I would say, a more traditional Mike or inside linebacker that people think about, where you had in your traditional 4 down front, you have, for instance, like, as Ohio State's played it, like the nose guard has the A gap between the guard and the center, and then the Mike linebacker has the B gap between the guard and the tackle. And so, he's responsible for that gap. So, very literally a plugger who's gonna fill that gap. Or in the old days where you used to play I formation football and a team would run isolation plays, the guy that's gonna take on the fullback and keep an arm free and be able to make the tackle. And so that is something. Again, it's more of old school way of linebacker play that everyone thinks about, from Dick Butkus to Chris Spielman, for lack of a better word. Whereas a more modern approach, if you will, again, is to, instead of forcing the football back inside, is to make it spill to the sidelines, and where you can run guys down laterally. And so that changes the defensive line techniques, which in turn changes how you want linebackers to play. But as you said, Knowles said in that press conference, like, listen, if one of my best linebackers is more of that type, I can change the defense around. I presume that would involve, again, changing some of those techniques. So rather than always spilling it outside, you're using that linebacker more, at least one of them more within the tackle box, and then changing how the defensive line plays with in turn with that.
Would that kind of change make you more vulnerable to outside running plays or inside running plays or RPOs? Or I mean, from a schematic standpoint, how would that maybe change things in terms of what, because he obviously has what he wants to do on defense. There's obviously a reason he wants to do what he wants to do on defense. What would that change in terms of what they can and can't do if that's what they're stuck with?
It can be done effectively. It's just that there's areas where teams offenses now take advantage of it. So like we saw it with Ohio State against Michigan this year. So, when you're trying to play, for instance, like counter tray where you have a pulling guard and then a tight end leading, if you have the defensive line and try to force that football inside, that can really cause some issues in terms of it creating natural gaps that then you guys can't scrape over the top, particularly if backside linebackers are being held by RPOs. And so it does raise some of the same concerns that were raised last year. Now, I trust that Knowles would know how to more effectively handle that change within the structure of his defense than what we saw last year. But it would certainly be a change. And, as I said, just because those four guys jump to mind doesn't mean that like a Tommy Eichenberg can't run and play in space. I mean, he wasn't really asked to do that last year, so I can't really speak to how he would do it. So it's not that I'm writing people off per se. It's just more like this is sort of what Knowles has done in the past. Like Malcolm Rodriguez is a good example of a Jim Knowles linebacker who, ran like a 4.5 at the combine, and it's like more of a big safety type, really, like at 5'11", 225, 230. So that's been more what he's done, but he has different types of athletes now too, so could be tweaked as well.
All right, as members of the Ohio State football media, we are contractually obligated to discuss the Leo position in any conversation about the 2022 Ohio State defense. So this is us ticking that box and discussing the Leo position. It seems like you don't think that's going to be a particularly big element of the defense this year. Can you explain what, again, you explained it a little bit differently from the way that I think people might perceive what that position really is, but can you explain sort of how you explained it on the board, but also why you don't think that's necessarily going to be a huge piece of the defense this year?
Yeah, well, I just think that Ryan Day keeps telegraphing it every time that media members ask. He's like, we're a 4-down base front team. Like, that's what we're practicing. Like, we might mix that in some, but like we're a 4-down base front team. So he keeps saying it. I think partially because they're just a different caliber of defensive end. So, to me, what the Leo, it sounds fancy, but really what it's doing is changing up the gaps for the offense to have to deal with. So in some ways, you are using that weak side defensive end as a pawn, essentially. You're literally throwing them into an interior gap to cut off like down blocks against like gap run plays like counter tray, or, forcing the offensive line to adjust on the fly to what defenders have what gap. And so, at an extreme level, like, do you use Chase Young to throw him into the interior A gap and take, to free up players? So the better the defensive ends you have, maybe the less you want to use it. I do think there are differences at the margins as well between the Big 12 and the Big 10. I think there's more similarity than there used to be. In the Big 12, Jim Knowles saw plenty of 2 tight end sets. But there's certainly more of a focus on, I still think, on the run game in the Big 10, and it changes a little bit of what you have to do, and a lot more, use especially of like wide zone plays and the like, so that it's going to require more of a structure up front and a little bit less of them moving around. And so, all those, and finally, again, you got to walk before you can run, and so that's not what Ohio State's defensive players are used to. It's not what Larry Johnson's used to, and so, you probably want to focus first on the things that, like, there's overlap between what Jim Knowles wants to do and what Ohio State's done in the past before moving on. So, I think to your point, yeah, I guess people sometimes think of it as like a pass rushing thing. It's not. It's really a rundown, sort of muck up the middle, again, to spill the football to the outside, which is ultimately the goal. So that it does fit together that way. So especially to the extent you don't want to spill the football outside, like that, you're going to use it even less, because then you do need that defensive end structure to contain the run game.
All right, and you had an interesting observation about Cade Stover, who has been one of those other people that we've been talking about a ton this year, and they during the offseason, we're talking about moving him back to the defense, and now maybe he's back to tight end. And, they really want to find his forever home, like we're going to talk about him like he's a rescue dog or something like that. But he really, okay, he's been here now for 3 years. Like you've got to find a place for him and let him play there. You had some interesting thoughts on where he maybe does or doesn't fit on this defense, and then why he, maybe the move to tight end might make sense. What was your thinking there?
Well, again, and I mean, I think Jim Knowles kind of hinted at this as well in his last presser. Is like, I got to find a way for him to attack or, play downhill, which to me is synonymous with like not in space like I tend to have my Mike and Will linebackers play. And so, I mean, maybe it works. I mean, to me, he seemed like a guy that you would use in that Leo role to the extent you want to do so. But again, like if you're doing that, then you're taking, a Zach Harrison or a, Jack Sawyer off the field. Like, do you want to remove one of those guys to use the Leo role? I struggle to see him as like a Mike or Will linebacker in this system. I mean, again, maybe I'll be proven wrong. And so then he's sort of stuck as a tweener between being a linebacker and a defensive end. There's not really like a, old school Sam linebacker like Bobby Carpenter used to be for Ohio State or, So it's sort of hard for me to see where he fits on defense. Where conversely, I mean, they have a gigantic hole at tight end. And so he would be he was the second tight end last year. So he would be the most natural starter there. So, him playing tight end makes sense to me just based on what I know about the structure of Knowles' defense. But again, I do think Knowles has the ability to tweak things around. It's just a matter of, that player probably needs to prove they're really worth putting on the field on defense to like change the structure of the defense for.
All right. And then the last thing before we let you go, another thing we got to talk about, they got a couple 5-star true freshmen coming in this year. One, CJ Hicks, already on campus. You mentioned him briefly earlier. But, where do you see Hicks and Sonny Styles potentially fitting this year? Where no one is saying anyone's going to start. Let's pump the brakes on that a little bit. But where do you see those two guys potentially fitting into the defense this year?
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that Hicks is going to be a Will linebacker. And in fact, I think he said that they were starting him there. Mm-hmm. Styles, I guess, body type wise, is going to hard to project. But I would assume he will start as the boundary safety. Again, this gets into how Knowles structures the defense. The boundary safety already has to have at least a little bit of linebacker in him. He is the person who is often going to be tasked with coming downhill to fill the run, particularly the short side of the field, because, Knowles wants to keep that nickel out of the fit. And so you're going to be down a man to the boundary. And so, again, we're looking at these safety positions, and Knowles in the first presser, it seems like that, he's playing Ronnie Hickman at the field safety and Court Williams at the boundary safety. I would say that, Court Williams is a pretty big safety at this point. I mean, I think they list him at 220 pounds. So, him and Styles are sort of that same size, that to the point that we've talked about in the past, maybe Court Williams would be a linebacker. But he seems to really like his ability to come downhill while still functioning as a safety. So that would be my assumption. We'll know a lot more once we see it in action in the spring game in terms of positions and where guys stack up. But I do think that they've given some hints at least, and Knowles is pretty effusive in his praise of both Court Williams at that spot and Hickman at the field safety spot, and so that seemed like a pretty permanent thing. And so again, to me, Sonny Styles kind of fits that sort of, you're athletic enough to be a safety, but you can certainly big enough to come down and play the run and fill as from cover 4.
All right. Well, Ross, appreciate you taking the time to come on and sort of explain your thinking on that kind of stuff. I saw that thread on the board and I went, oh, this would be a good show. So always excited to have you come on and share your insight. And if you'd like to find Ross's insight on football and pretty much anything else you want he feels like sharing, you can find him on Twitter at Ross R. Fulton. He is a great follow. He will interact with other folks who are really smart scheme people as well. And you end up learning an awful lot. And, as far as stuff you can read on Twitter, that is probably about the top of the pyramid. So give him a follow at Ross R. Fulton. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.